This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon. Hi, hello to everyone who's joining us. Good afternoon. Just going to give a few more moments just to let some more people in. Just give a few more moments there. Hello to everyone who's joined so far. Very warm welcome. Give it a moment or so, let everyone else join us before we begin. Time check. It's just 3 now, so I'll give a moment or so. Okay, I think I'll probably begin now. So good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to you all joining us this afternoon for Safeguarding in Your Organisation with Irish and Britain and our delivery partner, Diane West, who we're delighted to be joined by and who I'll hand over to shortly. Before I do, just a brief bit of housekeeping from me. So as with all our training sessions, this one is being recorded. It will be uploaded onto our members area shortly after the live event, and everyone will have access to that, and I'll send that round once we're finished. You're not on screen and your mics are off, but we encourage as much engagement and questions as possible. So please do send anything through to the chat box or the Q&A box, which should be on the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll be monitoring that throughout. I'll be asking questions, answering questions. We'll have little breaks where I'll put questions to Di that you send through, and then we'll hold some space at the end specifically for Q&A. So please send everything to me. What I'll do is I'll disappear off the screen now, but I'll be monitoring the chat and Q&A in the background. And I think that's probably it in terms of housekeeping. So I'll hand over to Di to kick off our session today. Over to you, Di.
Lovely, thank you, Aisling. Welcome to everybody. I know Aisling's already greeted you really nice and warmly, and welcome to those of you particularly that have come to some of our seminars before. We've, as usual, had this slight hiccup with the screens and the presentation, so I'm really sorry, but I'm going to be asking Aisling with her cooperation in moving us along as we go through the different slides. So I'm sorry about that, but Aisling is usually quite good at my cues, and I kind of go, next one please, Aisling, and give a thumbs up, and she just rows on. So this afternoon we're going to be talking about safeguarding and the different building blocks that you're going to have in your organisation to look at this particular area. So we're going to approach it in a very, very strategic way and in a broad brushstroke kind of way. So I'm going to ask you, Aisling, to move to the first slides and to look at some of the things that we're going to cover. So what this is going to be all about is raising awareness and how you can then start putting things in place that you may or may not have in place already. So it's an hour just going to be spending looking at some of these issues, and we're also going to be looking at some of the practice and about what do we need to look for, just to get you thinking and reflecting about how you're implementing safeguarding within your organisation. Often we think of it very directly as affecting those of us that are working with children or young people or vulnerable adults. But actually, when we scrape the surface, we realise that we're actually working or are in contact. Many of us are going to be in contact with vulnerable adults. And so this is going to be very, very relevant to you. And the next one, please, Aisling. So some of the things that we're hoping that you're going to get out of it is around what kind of policies and procedures you've got in place, and how often you might want to review those, and how that's actually implemented through the organisation, and whether they're shared through the organisation, and do we need to be looking at training some people more than others on safeguarding and managing the risks that we're seeing day to day. I come at this as a very practical subject area, and that's from my own experience of managing a range of organisations. Just to get back up my bus a little bit, I know some of you have heard this before, but I've been working in the voluntary sector. A little bit about me: I've been working in the sector for over 30 years. I've been an independent consultant since about 2003, but before that, I've managed different sorts of organisations and been a part of like running a CVS type organisation or Council for Voluntary Service, a women's refuge, a youth counselling service, and a community centre. And for many years, I've been on the kind of manager or practitioner side of things. So I'm coming at this with a very kind of like practical dimension, really, and about how we look at trying to keep people safe and training our staff and volunteers in a very practical way to raise concern and awareness of this particular issue. Okay, so we're hoping that by the end of it, you'll know where to get some further support, and we're going to provide some of that for you. A greater understanding as to whether you need to be looking into things yourselves more so, and where to look and where to improve. So if you're thinking as we're talking and going along, please do make notes of the kind of actions that you might want to take. So you might be using this as a checklist to just say, okay, you know, I think I'm doing all that I need to be doing. But also you might use this as a way of just asking some questions and thinking about this particular area in a broader way. And the next slide, please, Ashley. So we're going to be talking about the different sorts of vulnerabilities that people have, and about defining some of that, and also, of course, looking at whose responsibility it is. And so if most of you are a charity, then we're looking at the board or the trustees and those volunteers that are your trustees taking that responsibility, and they are fully responsible, as you know, for all of the activities that happen for your organisation and for keeping people safe whilst in your organisation and receiving those services. We're going to be looking at how safeguarding fits in with the range of activities that you've got, and about how that extends to things like looking at managing confidentiality. And I know this is quite a sensitive one when you're working on a very local level, and where people who know each other perhaps may have known each other over many, many years, and about how can we manage to keep those people safe and their information confidential as well. So this is, you know, it extends in a whole range of ways. So the next slide, please, Ashley. So having a look at those trustees and looking at the duties, basically, with regard to safeguarding, there's an expectation, particularly if you're a registered charity, that you would be taking reasonable steps to protect people from harm who come into contact with your charity. So that's including things like whether you work online, and I know a lot of you under COVID have started to experiment with the different ways that you offer your services, and many have moved online. But it does raise that question about the trustees being responsible about how those things get implemented, and whether you're working in person with people or whether you're working online. This affects all the people that are in contact with your organisation. So whether that's the beneficiaries that are using your service, the staff that are actually working for you, or the volunteers that are working at all levels of the organisation. Please do ask us any questions along the way. I know Ashling's encouraged that, and we do try to encourage participation. And I know it's hard when you're sitting out there and I'm in full flow of having chat, but we really do welcome your participation, and any things that you want clarified, we'll try and do it here. And if we're unable to do that, we'll be very happy to follow up and find out for you later. So let's take a little look now at the next slide, which will tell you about the different types of abuse. Now, this is not exhaustive. It is actually technically a much longer list. So this just covers some of the ones that, you know, an up-to-date list. But I've just picked some of those to explore with you here today. And all of our safeguarding, our policies and procedures, will need to actually, when we're updating it and keeping it updated, and by the way, it's recommended that we look at our safeguarding policies at least once a year, that we're looking at who we're meaning and the different types of abuse that we're looking for. And as I say, this has been added to in recent years. So, and some of it's going to feel less relevant to you, and others bits are going to feel more relevant. But it's about keeping in touch with how this is changing and who it's affecting. So there's some very obvious ones that have been on the list for many, many years, such as physical abuse and the emotional and psychological and things like that. And those are things not necessarily that you would spot through actually the people necessarily. You know, you wouldn't walk in the door and spot it immediately, but these are very delicate areas where you might actually be working with a vulnerable group of people, maybe running a lunch club, and it becomes over time that you begin to know the family perhaps, and the people that are working or living or caring with somebody that you're working with or a beneficiary. And over time you might notice things that begin to ring alarm bells for you. So whether that's neglect, for example, or more commonly that I've found when I've worked in areas for particularly those older people, so whether it's a lunch club kind of scenario, but the financial abuse can be something that comes up quite predominantly, I've found. I don't know what you might have experienced, and we welcome your own experiences as well. But financial abuse is something where people are beginning to get more frail. And what we mean by that is that somebody who's caring for them may start to, whether it's a carer that's a paid carer or a family member who begins to take money to do certain tasks, and then that actually begins to be you know, increases and over time escalates. So it's around looking at, as I said, these are not, you know, the only ones that are going to be there, but things have changed over time. We have people, yes, county lines. I've just noticed that somebody's mentioned about county lines. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work in Brixton, and that's often related to young people and around gun and gang and crime. Gangs, county lines in terms of trafficking, whether it's drugs or alcohol or people over different, and about how they're abused in different territories relating to gangs. So as we can see, I know it sounds as if it may not be as relevant to you on a day-to-day basis, but depending on where you are and where you're living and the types of beneficiaries that you're getting through the door, and about the kind of abuse that you think that they might, it's just raising that awareness and making sure that your volunteers are actually prepared and are skilled. I don't mean skilled but have an introductory level of awareness, so that they're looking out and are aware of what they would do if they were in that sort of situation. Yeah, so I've just noticed that Bernie has also mentioned about domestic violence. Of course, that's a you know, a very, very prominent one. As I say, this list, there is quite a big list, and what we're going to do is direct you towards the areas where we've prepared this presentation for you, so that you can get the much more comprehensive list for yourselves and to put within your policies and procedures. And the next slide, please, Aisling. So when we're looking at those different types of abuse and we're looking at our own policies and procedures, we'll need to actually be making sure that we cover those in our policies and procedures and keep our policies and procedures up to date. So in the section where it's talking about definition, we're talking about, you know, actually having very clear and plain, you know, wording to help our volunteers or our staff to understand what it is we're exactly looking for and what we mean. Looking at the definition there, when we're talking about adults, it's of course talking about adults who are at risk, are defined as somebody who may be in need of a community care service. So that's the definition that we have there, by reason of mental or other disability, age or illness. So it actually might not be somebody who would immediately seem to be somebody who might be a vulnerable person to you, but it's about thinking about how can we help our volunteers and our staff to identify when somebody is a vulnerable person and whether they are actually in positions of risk of exploitation or abuse. Okay, Aisling, next one, please. With the children's side of things, that's actually a bit more clear. It's people under 16, or if they've been in care, it can go up to the age of 25. On the adult side, the person at risk, you can see it may be somebody that they have a sensory impairment, or somebody with a mild learning disability even, somebody who's becoming more old and frail due to ill health. And it might be a temporary vulnerability or it might be longer term. So again, it's about saying, you know, we might not always consider our services to be those services where we take safeguarding very high on our agenda. And I suppose what we're saying is maybe if we look at it through these eyes, we're beginning to think, are we in contact with more people? Do we need to have a duty to protect people that we're working with more comprehensively? Aisling, the next slide, please. I notice there's a question there. Aisling, would you like to come in and...
Hi, Di. Yeah, just a question there.
I can't hear you actually, Aisling. Can you repeat that for me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Lovely. Yeah, just a question here in the chat that says, these are long-term vulnerabilities, and do we need to cater for short-term?
Yes, definitely, definitely. And that's, I suppose, that's a really good one. So obviously, many people have been affected by COVID in the last 2 years. That's a really good example. Or somebody that has an illness that has a passing vulnerability. Again, we're needing to say that at those times, those people are in a much more vulnerable position. And so what steps are we taking to identify if there's any risks? And this is the thing, I suppose, that's important, the key principle here, which is about how are we assessing our risks in the organisation day to day. So as those things are changing, and maybe some of the people have a passing vulnerability, but do we actually then assess the risk and readjust that as we're changing as organisations? So for example, if you've moved your services from being face-to-face to being online, what are the risks there? And what are the things that have, you know, what can happen? I know, for example, let me give you an example, and I'll kind of sprinkle these through. One organisation that I was working with moved some of their services from being face-to-face, and they had a community centre, and they closed the centre, and they then set up a WhatsApp group. Now, that was quite an interesting one in terms of safeguarding, because it became quite clear very quickly that the risks that were associated with running a telephone or a group that was using phones became quite significantly higher risk. Number one, because it meant that people were sharing people's details and it depended on how it was going to be done. But also it meant that the conversations weren't being monitored. And so therefore, there was a higher risk in terms of who should get access to that kind of information. How is that information stored? How do we keep track of the conversations and make sure that there's a protocol or some kind of code of conduct when we're running, kind of whether it's online or whether it's on phone or WhatsApp, about what's said or what's not said. And a really good example of that is where, you know, at one point somebody had revealed some information that was through a chat group that was inappropriate in terms of, you know, somebody talking about somebody who lived, you know, on the nearby, and they all knew who that person was. And then a conversation ensued that wouldn't have been an acceptable one to have, because it increased the risk of that person you know, being identified and being discriminated against, actually. So it's the kind of example where that gives you a good illustration where actually something changes within the organisation and it requires a fresh look and a fresh kind of pair of eyes at how we're offering those services and what does that mean in terms of both confidentiality and also about conduct. Yeah. Any other questions while you're there, Aisling?
Not just yet, Diane. No.
Okay.
Oh,
Lovely.
actually, sorry, one's just come through.
Yeah.
Someone has said, should we have separate policies for young people and adults? I suppose they've got different vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I've always found it, personally, I've always found it easier to, yes, because it's different legislative commitments that you have with those areas, and it's slightly different. So, well, quite significantly different, in fact. So you would follow different, there's a lot more to say for younger people in terms of how you would go about monitoring and delivering services and therefore safeguarding young people. And therefore I would actually choose to do it separately. So I'd have an older people's policy, or I would just say safeguarding adults and then safeguarding children and younger people as a separate thing. I would do. But if you're a small organisation and you're depends on how big your services are in terms of how much time, is it predominantly a children's service, is it proportionately only a small you know, what proportion of the organisation's resources go into that, and you know, how big the service is, how many people you're seeing, what kind of conditions you're seeing them in, and whether you're bringing people on site and they're coming to you and you're having to safeguard them within the building and on site is another whole consideration, and health and safety comes into that as well. So it's slightly different. Yeah. Okay, so we're also on talking about, do tell me if there's other questions, just pop in.
Yeah.
You know, we're also talking about, you know, substance misuse or person with a long-term illness or condition. And again, the person that's just asked the question, or actually not, you know, gave us a point of saying that these long-term illnesses, not necessarily, some can be shorter term. So, and I think that last point there, which is about unable to demonstrate the capacity to make a decision, that can sometimes change. You know, you can get people who have certain conditions where, you know, sometimes the condition may affect them that they are unable to make a decision, and they're you know, and they are in more need of care and support and safeguarding than other times. Okay, so really, I think this is about you and analysing for yourselves. Do we need to do some more work in this area, or do we think we've got it significantly covered at this time? Okay, next one, Aisling. Okay, and we're not going to touch too much on the legal framework today, but what I'll do is give you some signposting to this, because I want to cover some of the other areas which are much more practical, but looking at the age of consent of 16 years for children and young people. And but what we do have a duty of care to do is around reporting and about our contractual obligation to report. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the next step, please, sorry, next slide, please, Aisling, which is about saying, sometimes I think the biggest gap I've found when I'm working with some organisations and we're working on policies and procedures, one of the things that is a really good test of your safeguarding policies and procedures and the way you're managing it in your organisation is the test of saying that if something should happen, you know, albeit a minor thing, then would everybody know what to do? And so what we're trying to do is say, you know, there should be a confidence that you have that if a volunteer comes into the organisation and you've given them induction and whatever, and if they saw perhaps a carer slapping or being mean or, you know, doing something to the person they're caring for, would they know what to do? And so that's a really good, test of whether or not your systems and structures are working. And so what we're saying is that there needs to be somebody in the organisation. It's a good idea to have a trustee that takes a lead on the safeguarding to ensure things like the policy comes to the board once a year, to be able to review that, to make sure it's up to date, to make sure that you're assessing your risks, and also that there's somebody who's taking a lead on behalf of the organisation, and so that there's clarity in the organisation. And if you're a tiny organisation, it's somebody that's going to be named in the policy. If you should see something that you are concerned or unhappy about, this is what you do, that you contact, Aisling on this telephone number, immediately, and she will then, take it from there. So it will then be Aisling's decision. She'll probably be somebody that you've already put on some safeguarding training, that already knows what it's going to be like to work in a multi-agency kind of approach, and that they would take it up with their local LADO, as you can see there, your local authority designated officer, whose role it is to have an oversight of the allegations for practitioners and volunteers, and to ensure they compare that with a criteria, to ensure that they're recording and monitoring and progressing those situations in a timely and confidential way. So that would be the kind of litmus test, really, is what we're talking about. So somebody in your organisation that has more training, and that they're the lead person, and that they're the person who's going to be named in your safeguarding policies and procedures. And what you would be doing is ensuring that they know how to do, that they are in a position to be able to say, I think we need more advice about this one, or whether it's something that you can manage for yourselves within your own organisation. Okay. Aisling, hello there.
Hi, Di. Me again, popping up.
Yeah.
Just a question here in the chat. Someone has said, can you talk a little bit about reviewing the recorded information and what is best practice for this? So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they mean maybe noting a safeguarding issue. Where would you write that down in terms of recording best practice for that? I think that's probably
sure. And again, this is where you would have that written down in your, hopefully, if you're quite small organisations. And again, we can give you some examples of this. I mean, in fact, Aisling, I can probably send you a pack or an example of a pack where, if you're setting out and starting to get your safeguarding off the ground, or reviewing it thoroughly, and I can send that to you. But what you would do is have a very clear instruction about how you would want things recorded. You want things recorded as quickly as possible, and you want people to take a statement as quickly as possible, to just record what they said, what they heard, etc., etc. It's your responsible person, so your lead person's responsibility, to actually have got that training in how to record and monitor that. But they would be basically instructed to be able to take that information down as quickly as possible, and to take a statement from the person involved. What they do with that information then depends on all sorts of things. So that's where they need the training, really. So recording in a basic way, what you'd have in your policy was that you would be recording, and that you'd be taking statements from all parties, as quickly as possible. I don't mean, as feels appropriately possible, depending on the type of incident or that you're talking about. Does that make any sense?
It does. And then just to follow on to that, Di, they've said, and also when we've recorded, how do we review it in case there are multiple incidents with one client? I suppose there are certain trigger thresholds. I think they call them triggers, or maybe it's to do with the severity of the safeguarding issue. Just a little bit from kind of my experience, but I suppose it would just be recording one incident and then.
And this knocks on to that area, doesn't it, about data protection and about how we keep those kinds of records, and whether we, how we're keeping our data generally, which is more of a kind of interesting you know, not only how we're keeping that kind of information and recording it, but also where we keep it in terms of the whole organization, who has access to that, how do we keep things safe, you know, in locked places or in protected files, whether it's online, whether we protect people's identity. Because unless, you know, depending on the severity, you may not escalate it further, but you may keep a note on somebody's file. And if you're in a very informal organization, and this is about you making decisions about records and about monitoring, isn't it? About if you're running a lunch club, it may feel less intrusive for you, but it might be quite essential that you take notes on individual people that come in and take part in the lunch club. So for example, I'll give you an example of that, is where you get funding from an organization to run the lunch club. You might want to be collecting information about how people are becoming healthier through having your lunch club and having regular food and regular social contact, and how that makes people happier. And again, you might actually set up case files for those individuals. Again, you may then record this type of information that you're starting to see concerns, whether it's that you've noticed somebody's got physical bruising, whether somebody's beginning to actually withdraw and become more quiet and become much more stressed or anxious. You may note those types of things, and it's only when you actually sit and put something together that you begin to see, is this something that is actually a result of some kind of abuse that's happening at home, or, you know, after the time that they're coming in, and what you're seeing is a gradual deterioration for that person. So at what point you then say, actually, do I have enough evidence? You know, you may not have any evidence, but only when you're collecting that consistent information do you become more aware that when you're putting a pattern of things together, that you may then decide, actually, I need to get further advice. Does that, I don't know if that tackles it. Please do come back at us and ask us. It's really useful.
Yeah, do.
Yeah. Next one, please. Yeah. So, of course, we don't act alone. And we've got, these are some organisations that you might want to actually be in contact with, and as part of that network. And the next one, please, Aisling, because I want to get on to talking about, this is just raising your awareness, again, of how this is managed on a local level, and the multi-agency safeguarding hub, which is the front doors of the reporting side of it. And their role is the team of people to review and make decisions, as you can see. A multi-agency approach, so it's all those different individuals, and this is how the overview, that's changed a little while ago. It used to be structured quite differently, but I understand this is the current structure. You may find, depending on where you're actually coming, where you are in the country, because I know that Irish in Britain is a national membership, and so you might be coming, please check out your local situation, because it may differ slightly from what I'm talking about. Please, you know, forgive me if that's the case, because you might have something that's slightly different in your particular area, and slightly, you know, slightly different to what we're saying here. Aisling, and the next, please. So we've actually already started talking about these considerations about the way we manage information and about that confidentiality and data protection. Some of the legislative side of it, you know, it touches on the data protection side. So we've got different things coming in all the way. So not only are we talking about safeguarding here, we're also talking about data protection and the way we're keeping people's information. And don't forget, with data protection, it's about getting people's consent to keep information in the organisation. So what you'd be asking people to do, it's not enough just to say, oh, you know, do you mind if we keep this on file? It's about actually them signing their permission for you to be able to keep information about them. And health and safety was the other one I wanted to mention here. So there's a few, you know, different areas that I think come into this. Safeguarding is the same as health and safety in the respect that it's our responsibility and everybody's responsibility in the organisation for health and safety, as well as for safeguarding. But in order to actually implement that, we've got to make sure that people understand that that's their role. Otherwise, you know, it's left to the other individuals and everybody thinks, oh, it's not me, it's somebody else, it's somebody else. And safeguarding is certainly an area where I think that happens in practice on a day-to-day level. You know, there might be a group of people that notice something and everyone's not sure who's the person who's going to be responsible to do something about it. And the next one, please, Ashley. So, as an overview, what we're looking at then for safeguarding is we're looking at evidence that there's practice and policies in place. And then, so the evidence would be the actual policy and the procedures that are maybe written down. Then you've got how many people understand it. So evidence of there being something in place, understanding that's shared, that everybody understands their role in doing whatever it is that they're expected to do. The implementation, that it's actually being put into practice and people are being vigilant and that the monitoring's happening. And that we avoid the complacency that can creep in over time very easily. And I think when you're working with very local communities where everybody gets to know each other very well, I think that can happen more so perhaps, is that we all trust each other and we get to know each other, and you know, you find yourself thinking, oh, I'm sure that's, you know, fine, or you know, it can happen much more so when you're living with people that you've known for a very long time. And then you've got the review. So you've got evidence, understanding, implementation of putting it in practice, and making sure that it's reviewed on a regular basis. And just to remind you that one of the biggest recommendations at the moment is that your safeguarding policy, unlike other policies that you might leave for a couple of years, would need reviewing once a year. Okay, next one, please. So just pulling that out a little bit further about the evidence and the paper trail there. So we're talking about the human resource side of things, and the way that we train and recruit and support and induct not only your staff but your volunteers as well. So making sure that we're recruiting the right people. And when we say the right people, we're talking about how we're going to be assessing people, and we're going to get into that, and about how we're keeping records of a paper trail that we've taken steps to ensure we're keeping people safe. So the next one, please. So when we're looking at the different roles that we need, whether it's volunteers or staff, we're looking at the design of the role, what people need to have in place, what kinds of people that we want, and being clear about translating that into a role description or a task description or a job description, depending on whether you're recruiting volunteers or staff or trustees. You may well, when you're recruiting for trustees, for example, be wanting to put on the next advert, we're interested in having somebody with some safeguarding experience of managing safeguarding in their workplace, or you know, that you're going to specifically recruit if you feel that your board is lacking, a bit like any other area, that you would recruit somebody specifically with those skills and abilities, or that you might want to give them training to develop that area. But I'm all one for having your trustees all taking on lead areas of responsibility, and so safeguarding would be no different. In the same way that you need a very balanced board, we hope and we pray, we're always striving to get people in with a wide range of skills, but we're trying to get a balanced board and having everybody contributing something, and therefore taking up different lead areas of responsibility. This carries through with the job descriptions and person specifications. So, you know, we need to be much more open and transparent around having safeguarding as something that we're expecting people to get engaged in and want to know more about. And we're going to talk about in a moment just disclosure and barring service checks, but talking about having people, particularly if you're going to recruit somebody in a role where they are going to be working with vulnerable people or with children, you will be needing to think about whether they're eligible to get a disclosure and barring service check. And in the recruitment side of it, you'd need to be telling people in advance that they'd need to have that check undertaken if you were going to be doing that. Again, looking at the ongoing support and making sure people keep up with their training, because it's all well and good to get, you know, a bit of training done, and it's about that continuity and maintenance, which becomes quite hard to manage over time, and keeping up that level of understanding of safeguarding and keeping involved in what's happening in your local area too. And again, just ending on that same note that I started with at the beginning there about having a lead trustee that might take up this mantle of responsibility. Okay, next one, Aisling. Any questions as we're going along here?
Not at the moment, Di. Can you hear me, Di?
Maybe things gone for, have you gone for a cup of tea, Aisling?
No, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just about now, yeah.
Oh, sorry, that must be my microphone, but we don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, oh, you know, you've got it there. Okay,
Modern technology.
No problem, no problem. So basically, when we're looking at the actual policy now or procedure, it will have 4 components. So just this is a little checklist for you to make sure, just to check out and see whether your current policy is fit for purpose. What you'll expect to see is a statement where you'd say, you know, this is a safeguarding policy for this organisation, and we are committed to keeping, you know, people safe, etc., etc., etc. The description, which is a clear bit of the definitions, and again, we can give you samples and templates of these if you'd like to do a little comparison. The process, this is the bit where you're putting it in practice for your organisation. So every organisation is going to be slightly different, and depending on your resources and how you implement those, it's going to be slightly different. Every organisation might be slightly different about how you're going to put in practice. But in that process bit is where it's going to say, if you should see something that you are concerned about, this is what you do. And you'd need to keep that, you know, whether it's and emphasising again that you're going to have a named person in there to contact and a number and where they're based. And if they're not available, what do you do next? So it's a what if. The review bit of the policy is saying that we've all as a committee agreed this on this date at this time at this particular committee meeting, and we're going to be updating that in a year's time, and Diane's going to be responsible for this, and you're going to name somebody who's going to take a lead in making sure that comes back to the board, and then you're going to sign that off and date it as a trustee board meeting. So that's what you'd expect to see. I think in probably about 75% of policies and procedures that I see to look at, one or something of those is not, you know, is missing. So I think if you go back today and just have a look through your policy, and that actually applies to all your policies and procedures, there needs to be those 4 different components there. Often the review is missing. So just a tip there. Okay, Aisling, next one, please. We've already touched on with the understanding side of it, and about helping everybody understand what their role is and about what do they need to know. So it might be that volunteers need to know what a definition of, you know, what kind of abuse, you know, what does physical abuse, you know, look like? What are the symptoms? What are the things that they might be looking for in particular sorts of abuse? Whether somebody's being neglected and what that can look like, So it's just basic awareness that people need, and just where to go next if they're concerned is the bare minimum that you'd need to ensure that everybody was aware of. And the next one, Aisling. So here's a little checklist for you, which is about the understanding. So it's having access to policies and procedures. And a point of good practice is that your policies and procedures should be available for the public. So if you was to have something, you know, displayed up or on your website, or, you know, those things should be open and accessible for people to be able to say, where would I be able to find, you know, and they should easily be able to access that. If you don't have a website, it could be something that you produce and put on the wall, or it could be something that you, I can't think of many other ways of actually, you know, whether you give it to people when they first arrive in a little booklet, and you boil things down to really basic, easily understandable terms. Again, training, who and how often. There might be some people that are trained much more thoroughly and that they cascade that learning through the organisation. You also might want to remind people of their roles in these different areas when you have one-to-one supervisions, if you actually have one-to-one supervisions, or you have lead volunteers, or you have volunteer meetings, or you have team meetings. Keeping the issue alive, reporting back on training or reporting back to the committee, but also just trying to create that kind of learning and that safe space where people feel able to actually say, you know, I have no idea what you mean when you say, you know. Okay. And the next one, please. Aisling, have you got a question there?
Hi, Di. Sorry, I think I was just asking a question.
I can't hear you again.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now. Yeah.
I think there's just a slight delay there when I turn my video on. Somebody has said, is there a ratio of safeguarding volunteers to children and adults in your organisation? It's a good question.
It's a ratio. There are ratio numbers, and there are different numbers depending on the age group of child. So if you're talking about, we can give you a whole list of those, because it would depend on on the age group. If you're dealing with, you know, tinies, it's going to be a higher ratio number. If you're dealing with slightly older, it's something like 1 in 10 for under 11s, and then it's, you know, so there are a ratio, a sliding scale of numbers. But yes, there is. And as you get down to nursery, it's even higher. So it's yeah. But we can get you those, that's no problem. And we can answer some of those and leave that on the website for you, or you can do it individually, Aisling, and we can make that response to you.
Absolutely.
But yes, there are ratio numbers. So if you're working up to 11s, that's going to be a different ratio number. If it's 11 to 16, it's going to be a different one. And then over 16s, it's not. But then it depends on whether those people have a learning disability, if they have carers, or if they've been in care. That you'd consider them a vulnerable person as well. And so the age group and the duty of care is older too. Okay, so the question here about the implementation is about the monitoring, and this comes back to the question that we had earlier, which is, how do you undertake your monitoring? Is it something that you just visually see and then you report it and then you write it down in a logbook and you keep the identities separate, or do you do it in individual case files? As long as you're logging something down and you're able to tell, and depending on the actual what you've seen and the severity as to how, you know, whether you'd escalate that further more immediately or not. But again, this, I suppose we're trying to say in this session, have we thought about these things and about flagging them up for further discussion and further consultation? And the next one, please. So when we're talking about implementation, I'm also talking about the types of services that you're offering. So for example, You might, I know an organisation, for example, that decided to have a summer programme, and instead of using their own premises, they were going to encourage everybody to come to the local park. Now, a lot of people, may not think that that's not, it's not their responsibility to make sure that the park is clear and safe, and not only health and safety wise, but the organisation, whenever you're bringing people to an event, they're your responsibility, and therefore you would be deemed responsible, and it would be under your insurance that you would be offering that service. And with safeguarding, it's the same. So basically, if you were going to be running a park event, you would need to ensure that you had marshals there, that they were out the night before, that you were risk assessing the environment, that you were risk assessing the area, and that you were checking to see whether there was any additional risks that you were taking through doing that activity at that particular place at that time. A good example of that is where if you work with a bunch of young people, and we were talking about the county lines, particular criteria, and where I live, quite near me, there is a triangle of gang space. So there are 3 gangs within 3 particular areas, and you would not offer an activity you might do unknowingly in a park that is on the perimeter of those 3 different areas. So you wouldn't be doing that. You wouldn't actually run it in that park anyway. But if you did, you certainly wouldn't run it at 6 o'clock in the evening, because as it begins to get dark, dusk and darkness, you would have a problem with getting children coming to that space because of the county line and the territory that those that the park is on at that particular geography. So that's a particular demonstration of that. I mean, it's a good illustration just to talk about risk assessment, but talking about a particular safeguarding issue that was very relevant in this borough at the moment. Yeah, Ashley.
Thanks, Di. Can you hear me?
I'm just waiting for your voice to kick in.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Very strange. So Di, a question here says, is it recommended that all safeguarding conversations or concerns are logged formally, or are those just for raised alerts? So can you have an informal, I suppose, conversation with colleagues about safeguarding without noting it on record?
I think you can have a conversation. I think it's worth logging it, because for the reasons that we talked about earlier, continuity is a difficulty. If people come and go, and staff may come, staff may go, volunteers may come and go, and I think having something logged, it's how you log it that's really important, isn't it? But for you to even raise it as an issue, you've got almost that concern there already. So I would say it's better to be safe than sorry, and to actually log it, but also it's how you log it and where you keep it and how you keep it that's more of the concern. So it's the fact that you're actually talking about it as an issue and as a safeguarding issue is a concern anyway.
Oh,
isn't it? If you're already talking about that, then it's worth it being logged. Whether it's worth escalating anywhere else, this is where people, I think, get very nervous and very, they don't, and I think that's because people are not sure what to do. And to reassure you that the role of a thing, like LADO, for example, is to help you make the right decisions. It's not necessarily to just whisk it out of your hands and kind of escalate issues all over the place and get the police in. And, so I think we need to be quite confident and trying to build safe spaces where people are going to feel listened to, that they can raise things, you can note it down, you log it, that's what you've been told. And if you having had more training as the lead person in your organisation are not sure, talk to the LADO and see what they say, and you decide between you. So it's a continued discussion. It's not something that just rests on one person's shoulders. But what we're trying to do is create environments where people feel confident enough to say so.
Yeah.
You know, say something is, and your staff or your volunteers feel confident to come to you and say and mention things. You log it down, but you may choose to do no more with it at this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then you've had more training and you'll get some more criteria to help you make that assessment.
Okay.
So coming back to your events then, we just touched about ratio numbers for children's work, yes, and volunteers working under supervision. Again, depending on what type of activity, you'll be having volunteers. And again, we're going to talk about DBSs now, just very briefly, and about, you know, volunteers working with other people, and all of those things are things that may be relevant to you. Traveling to and from events, I think what I was thinking there is that your activities or the activities of your organization, you need to know where they start and stop. So for example, if you was to say, oh right, we're going to have a football tournament and we're going to get all of our young people, we can arrange lifts for them with all the families. You're then extending that service to collection with cars and having increased insurance and therefore higher safeguarding risk. If you're thinking about people travelling other people's cars that haven't been assessed and risk assessed. So it's about raising the awareness of where does your service end. If you're offering those lifts and you're offering to get people to and from things, that's an increased risk and a change of service or an extension of your service, and may incur extra insurance costs, by the way, because all of those drivers would then need additional insurance to be able to offer that service. That's an interesting one. It was an interesting one. Next one, please. So we're going to actually send this to you, this PowerPoint that you've been looking at, and I put a lot more detail in here than we're going to be able to get through this afternoon, because this is part of a bigger session that we were running, but we wanted to give it to you anyway, and it will give you a lot more information, so don't be worried that there's going to be more information. I'm going to skip through a few now, but basically what we're trying to say is, you know, looking at the implementation of our services, are we actually feeling confident of our of the way we're managing safeguarding and health and safety in the organisation? Are there potential scenarios where there's increased risk, and are we assessing those appropriately? And is there a kind of list of actions that you think that you might want to take from today? Some ideas about, you know, how you want to change things, or how you want to improve things, or how you want to help creating this organizational learning culture where we're all being very clear about whose responsibility and what our role is in safeguarding to ensure that we're keeping people safe. I'm going to just nip through a couple of more slides that are all around DBS, because I want to make a couple of points. So DBS checks might be needed for some of the work that you're doing. DBSs are not automatic for all your jobs and all your work. There's different kinds of DBS, and I just want to nip through a couple of points there. So nip on to the next one, please, Aisling. There are some guidance. We're going to give you some links to some websites to read up on all this further, and the government website and Charity Commission are really good at safeguarding at the moment. Just this week I had an update from a newsletter all about safeguarding, so we can give you the link to that to help you to read up a bit further and to get the information that you've been asking a little bit about today in a bit more detail. On to the next one, please, Aisling. I want you to draw attention to the DBSs, the different types, and if you're getting a fully enhanced one, that you're not legally able to ask people to get one unless their role merits it. So if they meet a criteria where you're asking them to do a DBS, You'd have to advertise in advance that you were going to be doing that if it's the fully enhanced. And what you'd be doing is you wouldn't be able to be legally able to ask them unless it adequately, I'm trying to think, it was eligible. The role that you're asking them to perform came within the eligibility, so that either they were working with somebody with that were vulnerable people, or that it was with children, and it's for a significant period of time. There's an eligibility checker on the DBS website. So if you want to check the role that you're thinking of getting a DBS for, or getting a volunteer for, or getting a staff member for, and you want to know whether you'd be eligible to saying to people, yes, you know, we need to get you checked, there is an eligibility checker. So to the next slide, Aisling, I just wanted to raise that with you. And also just about the validity, that's the one that I wanted to go to, which is around, some people think that the DBSs you know, they're only kind of relevant for a period of time, but they actually have no official expiry date. So as soon as they're done, you know, some people choose to do them once a year for those roles where they are eligible. And then they encourage people to do the updating service, where they sign up for themselves to pay £13 a year to have their check kept alive, if you like. And therefore, wherever they go, they can give people access to that if they choose to do so. Any questions or queries about that one? Because I know that can be quite an interesting point for people, where they thought maybe they could just get everybody done and it's good practice, for example. Yeah,
And
Ashley.
No questions on that, Di. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Hey. No questions, no. But if anyone has any, you can send them through after the session, and between me and Di, we'd be more than happy to answer them, won't we, Di?
Of course, no problem. Yeah. So I'm gonna just do the last slide there now, Aisling, because I want to bring that to a close, and just to say, and it's got all the free types of check, and we can send this out to them so they can look in a little bit more detail and a bit more carefully at the slides. I just threw in too many today, Aisling, trying
That's
to give
right.
them too much information. But I'm going to go to the next slide, which is the last one. So I'm going to say next one along, I think, maybe. Oh no, gosh, there's lots of these. Sorry about that. Next one, next one, next one. Keep going. Yeah, reuse of DBS. DBS continued. Oh gosh, I went into a lot of detail there. Sorry about that. I'll give you that.
All right, that's okay. Shall I keep going?
Yep. And what I'm looking for is, there you go. And so what we're going to bring you to are the next steps. So the question is, have you got all the appropriate policies and procedures in place? If not, look at either the Irish in Britain website, where we'll be having some samples on there, and we can give you some information which I'll be able to send you today, Aisling, which I can, you know, forward on to people if they want to. Are people confidently implementing? Are they sure that they know what they would be doing? Are your volunteers sure? And are they suitably trained? And I don't mean, you know, big fancy training days, you know, that cost hundreds of pounds. I mean, you know, somebody just needs to understand what it is they need to do in their particular role in your organisation. How to spot and handle any concerns, clear system of reporting, setting out risks and how they're going to be managed. So it's risks for the organisation here we're talking about, and the trustees, and you know, where they're looking at how their services are changing. That you don't ignore, harm or downplay the failures is what the Charity Commission is saying. So a lot of this terminology has come from the Charity Commission, in that they're saying that trustees, you know, learn by our failures and our mistakes, and by, you know, things are always improving. Having a balanced board of trustees and somebody who's going to be a lead trustee for safeguarding, and also conducting the reviews of the policies and procedures on an annual basis. Lovely. I'm going to stop there and see if there's any more questions, and then hand back to you, Aisling.
Thanks, Di. We do have one question here, actually. I think we'll just take one more question and then wrap up, because I'm just a bit mindful of time. So a question here, Di, is it true you can let people work with children as long as they are being supervised whilst the DBS is coming through?
Under supervision, I must say, I have done that before. Yes, because, well, what happens is if you're running services where, if it's a care service, so first question is, do you have duty of care for the child? If preferably in that scenario, you would have families, or so you'd have a stay and play. So it would be like with parents, depends what your resources are, what your services are. Yes, I've had volunteers working under supervision while their DBS is going through. But you wouldn't have volunteers with sustained access to young people, certainly not working on their own with them. I've always kept volunteers working in twos anyway, and staff members where possible, you know, with volunteers as buddies. But yes, I have done that because of, I'm going to be really controversial and say that DBSs are part of a process of what you're doing, but they're not the be all and end all, because they're only as relevant as the time that you get them. You know, they're only as live as today when you've actually had your check. What on the legal side of it, you know, you basically there's two aspects to it, I think, which on the legal side, which is saying you can't ask people to get a check unless you're able to. So in other words, unless their job merits it. And I've got the other one that's gone out of my head, but yeah, so basically it's I've had people under supervision, but what's more important is that we've begun to get a bit kind of you know, we'll get people done willy-nilly, and actually we're not able to. It's not something that we're entitled to do. Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Di. Thank you so much for that session. It was a meaty one, wasn't it? Lots of information. And like both me and Di said, we'll send around these slides, won't we, Di? And if there's any questions that we haven't had time to answer or any additional information, then please email me. I'm sure you'll have my email address, but I'll be emailing you all anyway. And yes, thank you very much for joining us. Got some thank yous there from the chat. So yeah, thank you for all your contributions as well, because they really do make the session. And sorry for the tech issues.
Yeah, more interesting.
Yeah.
Pleasure to have you all here. And
yeah, lovely. Yeah, and we'll have our next session. I'll also send around some information about that. All right, so thank you all, and thanks, Di, and I think we'll bring that session to a close now. All right, thank you. Bye.
See you again. Bye-bye.